Today we start off with the chapter number 4, or the fourth lecture from the book. And today we'll talk about al-asabat wa anwa'uha. Asabat, or the residuary. So first of all, discuss about the linguistic and legal definition of the word asaba, followed by the evidence from the Quran and Sunnah that the asaba are also heirs to the legacy of the dead. Thirdly, we'll talk about the types of asaba and the levels between those types. Then in the case when a person has more than one asaba at a time, then who should the preference be given to? And amongst the types of asaba, there are two types known as asaba because of someone else, asaba bighayrihi, and asaba with someone else, asaba ma ghayrihi. We'll talk about those two types in details, their rulings, stipulations, evidence of their inheritance, and then we'll talk about the difference between these two types of asaba, ay asaba bil ghayr wa asaba ma'al ghayr. So residuary, or the Arabic word for it, is al-asaba, which linguistically refers to qarabatu rajul li abihi, the relatives of a person from their father's side. So usually all of a person's father's relatives would be their asaba, but you usually talk about the male relatives. So paternal uncle, his children, a person's brother, grandfather. So all of these are a person's asaba. But when talking about asaba in the mirath literature, there are different definitions that people have given. One is that every heir that doesn't have a predefined share. So those don't have a predefined share are considered as the asaba. But this is not a very comprehensive definition because we talked about the distant kindred, which are potentially someone's heir, but they also don't have any predefined shares in the Quran. So this definition is not as complete. The other definition, usually adopted by ulama ul-faraiz, or the ulama of mirath, is that asab are defined as those people who are, if they're alone, if they're the sole heir to someone, then they get everything that the deceased leaves behind. Or if they're not the sole heir, they have other ashabul furuz, or shareholders, then whatever remains after the shareholders have been given their respective shares, whatever remains all goes to this person. So this is the legal definition of what is known as an asaba. Now, what evidence do we have from the Quran and Hadith which supports this fact that the asaba, the category of asaba as heirs exists? So let's look at, first of all, Surah An-Nisa, verse number 11, talking about the parental shares of a person. وَلِأَبَوَيْهِ لِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا السُّدُسُ مِمَّا تَرَكَ إِنْ كَانَ لَهُ وَلَدٌ. If a person dies, then each of the parent is entitled to 1/6 if they leave behind an offspring. فَإِنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ وَلَدٌ. But if they don't leave behind any children, وَوَرِثَهُ أَبَوَاهُ, and the only people who are heirs to this deceased are his parents. فَلِأُمِّهِ الثُّلُث, then the mother receives 1/3. But see, the Quran is mentioning وَوَرِثَهُ أَبَوَاهُ, that both parents are the heirs, but it only goes on to define the mother's share, that's 1/3. And obviously, the logical conclusion is that if the mother share is defined, and we know that the father is also inheriting, and there is no one else, So all whatever will remain will automatically go to the father, which means 2/3 belongs to the father, not because his shares are predefined, but because he's an asaba receiving whatever is left after the mother has taken her share. Then you have verse number 176 of Surah An-Nisa, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, إِنْ إِمْرَؤٌ هَلَكَ لَيْسَ لَهُ وَلَدٌ وَلَهُ أُخْتٌ فَلَهَا نِصْفُ مَا تَرَكَ. If a man dies and he has no children, but leaves behind one sister, then she is entitled to a half of whatever he leaves. وَهُوَ يَرِثُهَا إِنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ وَلَدٌ. And the opposite is also true, meaning that if she dies and leaves only a brother behind without having any children of her own, then he will inherit from her. But the Quran is not specifying here again what he will inherit from her. Like in the case of the sister, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that she gets half. But in the case of the brother, there's nothing mentioned, which again proves that whatever she leaves behind will go to her brother. So he over here is an asaba. Then you have a hadith from Sahih Bukhari, which is very explicit in this regards, in which the Prophet Islam he mentioned al-hiqu al-fara'iza bi ahliha, that give the farais or the shares to whom they are entitled. فَمَا بَقِيَ فَهُوَ لِأَوْلَى رَجُلٍ ذَكَرٍ. And whatever remains should be given to the closest male relative of the deceased. So you can see that this hadith is defining the asab exactly as we did when talking about its legal definition. So after the shareholders are given their respective shares, whatever remains goes to the closest male relative of the deceased. And that is what asaba actually are. Now let's talk about the types of the residuary or the asaba. It's firstly divided into two broad groups, al-asaba al-nasabiyya, or the residuary due to relation, and the asaba as-sababiyya, the residuary which are non-related. As far as the residuary which are non-related are concerned, if a person he owns a slave and then he frees them, sets them free, then in this case the master becomes the asaba for that slave, and this is al-asaba as-sababi. But obviously does not concern us in this time and age. The second, which we talk about in Mirath often, are the asaba and nasabiyya of the relation. And these are of three kinds. You have al-asaba bin nafs, or the intrinsic residuary, which are those people who are born as asaba. So like your brother, your son, your father, your uncle, your cousin, all of them are born asaba to you. The second is asaba bil ghayr. They are residuaries not because of their own selves, but because of another, because of their male counterparts. And the third, you have asaba ma'al ghayr, which are asaba with another. They're also not intrinsically asabat. They adopt the ahkam of asabat in some cases. So intrinsic residuary, asaba bin nafs, residuary because of another, asaba bil ghayr, and residuary with another, asaba ma'al ghayr. Remember, whenever in Mirath we say the word asaba, we refer to the intrinsic residuary, the asaba bin nafs. Because whenever you want to refer to asaba bil ghayr or ma'al ghayr, you have to specify their status as well. So you're going to say asaba bil ghayr, or you're going to say residuary because of another. And you'll have to say asaba ma'al ghayr, or residuary with another. Because when you say the words just asaba or just residuary, it automatically refers to the intrinsic residuary. Now let's look at a detail into the ahkam of each of these asaba. Talking about the intrinsic asaba. So obviously the asaba is every male relative in whose connection with the deceased there is no female. So every male who in his connection to the deceased there is no female. And there are four directions of this type of asaba. The first is filiation, which is the connection with the deceased through being a descendant. So this includes Abnaul Mayyit, the deceased sons, grandsons, and great grandsons, and so on. And remember again that in Mirath, when talking about grandsons, we refer to the son's son and not the daughter's son. Then you have the parentage direction, which is basically the connection to the deceased in terms of ancestry. So this includes the deceased's father, his valid grandfather, al-Jaddu Sahih, meaning the father's father, the great grandfather, and so on. The third jiha or the third direction is fraternity, jihatul ukhuwa. So this includes a person's full brother or a half brother from the father's side, son of the full brother or son of the active brother, the half brother from the father's side. Always remember that the uterine brother or half brother from the mother's side is never part of the asaba. He is solely a shareholder that we've previously discussed. And the fourth jiha, it's called jihatul umuma, which does not have a specific English word, but understand it as the parental fraternity. By parental fraternity, we mean that uh, the uncle of the deceased and the uncle's children and their children and so on. So parental fraternity as in the brother of the parent, so the father's brother, and filiation as if in the father's brother's children. Right? So this includes a person's full uncle, meaning that the deceased grandparents are the parents of his father and the parents of his uncle. And it will also be a half uncle from the father's side, or an admit uncle, which means that the grandfather is the same, but the grandmother of the deceased is not the grandmother of his uncle. He has another mother. And also the children of his uncle and their children and so on. So these are the four directions in order of their importance, in order of their preference. So the first jiha is of the bunuwa, being a descendant of the deceased. The second is about being the ancestor of the deceased. Third is about being in the same line as the deceased, as in brotherhood. And the last is connected to the deceased via the father. We talked about that the asaba bin nafs, the intrinsic residuary, they have four directions. And I also mentioned that this is in order, which was mentioned before, which means that if one of them is present, just one, mm, and he's alone, which means that there aren't any sahib al-furuz, then he gets the entire wealth of the deceased. Or if there are other sahib al-furuz, then after giving them their shares, whatever is left will come to this asib. Now, in the case that the Sahib al-Furuz take all of a person's legacy, then obviously the asaba is left with nothing. For example, in the case if the wife dies, leaving behind a husband, a full sister, and the agnate brother. So, like we discussed, if the wife dies with no children, the husband gets half, right? And if there aren't any children, the sister also gets half the deceased. Now, half to the husband and half to the sister, nothing is left. So the agnate brother gets nothing. Although he's an asaba, but by definition, he gets whatever is left. And if there is nothing left, he gets nothing. So this was the case if it was only one asaba and the taraka was mustaghraq, or it was totally occupied by the shareholders. But in the case there are more than one asaba present, for example, the son and the brother, the son and the father, or the uncle and the son, right? Whatever two are present. Then the question is, how do you give preference? I mean, which category gets dominance over which? And within a category, which member gets dominance over which? So there are two ways to perform tarjih. One is to take into account the jiha, the direction of the asaba. So if there are more than one intrinsic residuary, first you will give preference with the jiha, with the direction, which means jihatul bunuwa, or the filial direction, gets preference of the others. So the descendants of the deceased, his sons, will take the entire mal or whatever is left after the ashab al-furuz. And if the sons are present, then the grandsons, and so on. Right? So, for example, if a person dies leaving behind a son, a father, and a full brother, so in this case, the asaba will be the son. He will get everything. The father obviously will get 1/6, not because he's an asaba, but because in this case, he is one of the ashab al-furuz. And the brother gets nothing because he's neither ashab al-furuz nor the asaba in this case. So this is tarjih bil jiha, or preference through the direction of, or the connection with the deceased. Now, we talked about that in the parentage direction, that included father, grandfather, great grandfather, and so on. And we know when one direction is given tarjih, then a person from the other direction is basically left out. So if the father is present, the brother gets nothing, right? Because the direction of the father is above than that of the brother. Similarly, the grandfather takes the place of the father, which would mean that if the grandfather is present, the brother should not be getting anything. That's logical conclusion, but this is an exception to the rule. That as far as the father is concerned, the brothers don't get anything when the father is present, when the father is alive. But in the case that the father is not present, but the grandfather is, the question is this the same case as if the father were alive, meaning that the brothers get nothing? Or is it that the brothers and the grandfather, they share, or they both become the asaba? There have been two opinions since day one, from the time of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, that the ar-ra'yu rajih, the preferred opinion by most of the scholars, is that the grandfather in this case is different from the father, which means although the brothers are left with nothing when the father is alive, that is not the case when the grandfather is alive. Means they are not completely blocked off in the presence of the grandfather. But this is a totally separate chapter on how this works, and we'll come to that later on. So this was the first mode of preference. that you give preference to the potential asaba through their jiha. The second is bid daraja. You look at the grades. So, for example, if there are multiple intrinsic asabat and their jiha is also the same, either their parentage, either their fraternity, filial, whatever it is, right? In this case, the one who has a higher grade, or in other words, is more closer to the deceased, gets preference over the one who has a lower grade, is more further in line in his connection with the deceased. So, for example, if a person dies, leaving behind a son and a grandson, so the mirath will go to the son and not to the grandson. So in this case, the son is the intrinsic asaba and not the grandson. Because although the direction is the same, but in the terms of grade, in terms of the daraja, the son is above the grandson, or the son is closer to the mayyit, the deceased, than the grandson. And so preference is given, secondly, through the grade. To summarize the method of giving preference, if there are multiple asabat with different directions, then tarjih is made amongst them in order of the directions mentioned. First comes jihatul bunuwa, then ubuwa, then ukhuwa, and then finally umuma. And if there are multiple intrinsic asabat with the same direction, then tarjih is made based on the grade of those people. Or in other words, one who is more close to the deceased. He is given tarjih over the one who is further away. So there is one question that some people ask is that in terms of this grade, the ibn and ab, they're both the same. I mean, there's a direct connection between a son of the deceased and the father of the deceased. Then why is it that the ibn or the son is given preference over the father? You can answer that easily because there's difference in direction. But the question is, how did you conclude that this direction exists, this difference in direction between son and father exists? I mean, it's logically conceivable, this difference between son and brother, father and brother, father and uncle. But how do you contemplate this difference between the son and father of the same person? So why is the ibn being given preference over the father? Why is this direction? And not just the ibn, even if it's the grandson, which is farther away from the son, yet he's still given a preference over the father because of him having a direction higher than that of the father. So why does this difference exist? So if you look at the Quran, the same verse of Surah An-Nisa, verse number 11, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَلِأَبَوَيْهِ لِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا السُّدُسُ مِمَّا تَرَكْ إِنْ كَانَ لَهُ وَلَدٌ. If a person dies leaving behind children, leaving behind a son and parents, each of the parent gets 1/6, right? So the Quran is mentioning that all three of these people will inherit from the deceased, both mother and father and the walad, the child or the son, right? Then the Quran mentions the share of the mother and father, that's 1/6, but keeps quiet about the share of the walad, of the son, which then basically means after giving 1/6 to the father and 1/6 to the mother, whatever is left will go to the walad, will go to the son. So you can see that the Quran, first of all, makes the category of the walad or jihatul bunuwa as being the asaba. So we're not the ones deciding who gets preference. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that has decided which direction is given preference over which. So that's what the text tells us. Then on the other hand, if you look at human nature, people give preference to their children than to their parents. I mean, they strive and struggle all their lives for the sake of their children. They wouldn't probably strive as much for the sake of their parents. And also the Prophet Islam, for this very reason, said, Al-waladu mabkhalatun majbanatun, that a person's children are a source of bukhul, of being stingy. Maybe you used to spend a lot in charity, but now you have children, you spend less because you want to save for their future. You want to spend more on them, right? So that's a feeling that increases. Also, majbanatun, that these children are a source of jabana, or a source of being afraid. So a person could have been very brave going to every possible jihad there was, but after they have children, it's very much possible that they're going to fear, maybe not their own lives, but the fact that if they die, then who will take care of their children? So children can be a source of a person being withholding his hands and being scared, right? So it's like a natural fitrat embedded inside a person that they give preference to their children over their parents. So that's a more logical emotional appeal to the fact that why jihatul bunuwa is given preference over jihatul uh, ubuwa. Now, to conclude, the asaba bin nafs, or intrinsic residuary, you might have known that la yakunu illa dhakaran. They're always male. There is no female who is an intrinsic asaba. So in no way, in no scenario, do any of the females become an intrinsic residuary on their own accord. There's one exception, but because it's related to slavery, so there's no point in discussing that. Now let's talk about the second type of asaba that we mentioned. That was asaba bighayrihi, a residuary because of another person. So these are four kinds of people, and all of them are women. First is a person's daughter. So she becomes an asaba with her brother. That is the deceased son. The second is the deceased granddaughter, and she becomes an asaba with her brother or with her cousin, which is the grandson of the deceased. So either the grandson is the brother of this granddaughter, or it's possibly he could be a cousin of her, because her cousin will also be the grandson of the deceased. So it doesn't have to be exactly her brother. It can be anyone in the same grade. And the third is al-ukht al-shaqiqa, or the full sister, and she becomes an asaba with her brother, who that is the full brother of the deceased. And the fourth one is the agnet sister, al-ukht li-abin, and she becomes an asaba with her brother, which is the agnet brother of the deceased. So all of these with their respective male counterparts become the asaba. And then the principle of لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ, that the male counterpart gets twice as that of the female, will be applied over here. So what are the conditions and stipulations regarding when is it that these women become the asaba? So first of all, she must be a shareholder, which means if she was never a shareholder, then even if her brother is the asaba at any given time, she does not become the asaba. So for example, the paternal aunt, right? She's not amongst the shareholders, but her brother, the paternal uncle, can potentially be an asaba. So for in a case that where he is the asaba, his sister, the paternal aunt, won't become the asaba. Similarly, for example, the full brother's daughter, she does not become the asaba when the full brother is present. Why? Because she's not amongst the ashabul furuz. She's not a shareholder. And the other example of the paternal aunt, the one that I just gave you. Second condition is that the residuary should be of the same grade. So, for example, the son does not make the granddaughter a residuary because their grade are different. The son is more close to the deceased than the granddaughter, right? Similarly, the son of a person's full brother does not make his full sister a residuary because their grades are different. The full sister is more close to the deceased than the son of the full brother. And the third condition is that the muasib or the residuary, and always remember when just talking about the residuary, we're referring to the intrinsic ones. So the asab or the muasib should be equal in relation to that uh, female. For example, al-akhli ab. So if you have an agnet brother, the agnet brother does not make the full sister of the deceased an asaba because her relation to the deceased, even though their grades are the same, I mean, they're both siblings, but among siblings, there is a difference in the strength of relation. If you share both parents, obviously that sibling is closer to you and has more of relative connection to you than a person who shares only one parent with you, right? So the residuary should also be equal in relation to the female. So again, half brother cannot make the full sister a residuary, even though the grade is the same, but their strength of relation is different. Wallahu a'lam. And the evidence for this is pretty simple. It's the same as we've talked about. لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنثَيَيْنِ. Wherever that's mentioned in the Quran, it's mentioned with siblings, with children, sons and daughters. It's also in verse number 11. It's mentioned with uh, siblings in verse number 176 of Surah An-Nisa. Now, why are they called asaba bil ghayr, residuary because of another? Because, like I mentioned, they aren't residuaries because of their connection to the mayyit. They only become residuary because of someone else. I mean, their brothers basically forced them to become the residuary. And the other thing to remember is that in these cases, all four of these categories, daughter, granddaughter, full sister, and agnet sister, they no longer remain as shareholders. They've totally transformed into becoming a residuary with their brothers or with their male counterparts, and they're no longer amongst the shareholders. And the third category that we have is al-asaba ma'al ghayr, residuary with another. And these are basically sisters, both full or agnet, with either the daughter or granddaughter, depending on who's present at that moment. So you have either the full sister with their daughter, and if she's not there, then the granddaughter. And the conditions for her becoming asaba ma'al ghayr, or in asaba with the daughter, is that the son should not be present, the son of the deceased. because in this case, the sister gets nothing, and the daughter herself becomes the asaba. The grandson should not be present because again, the sister won't get anything. He will be the asaba. The full brother shouldn't be present because if he is, then the full sister does not become the asaba with the daughter, granddaughter. She becomes an asaba with her brother, a asaba bil ghayr. And also the father shouldn't be present because if he is, then the father becomes the asaba and not the sister. And sometimes the half sister, the agnet sister, she becomes an asaba with the daughter or the granddaughter, but with the same conditions that the son, grandson, and full siblings should not be present, neither the father. Also, the half brother should also not be present because in this case, she will become asaba bil ghayr, uh, because of her brother and not with the daughter and granddaughter. Now, the fact that we know that there are intrinsic asabat, and those people who the intrinsic asabat make as asabat, meaning they connect others and make them asab as well. Stranger thing over here is that in this case, there are no males involved. There are only females. So neither the daughter or granddaughter, they're not intrinsic asabat, right? Which means that they don't transform the sisters into the asabat with themselves. Or in other words, the daughter and granddaughter, they're not the asaba, which means they receive their respective shares from the mirath. It's the sisters who are the asabat in this case only. So the daughter and granddaughter, they'll be ashab al-furuz, they receive their shares, nothing else. And whatever is remained afterwards will be given to the sisters. So that's the difference between asaba bil ghayr wa ma'al ghayr, that the residuary because of another transforms the shareholders into a complete residuary. In other words, there are no shareholders in asaba bil ghayr. All of them become asaba, all of them become residuary. But in this case, in asaba ma'al ghayr, in residuary with another person, the daughter and granddaughter, they remain as shareholders, and it's only the sisters that become asaba. And the evidence of this is also mentioned in Sahih Bukhari, that Abu Musa Ashari radiallahu anhu was asked a question about inheritance, about a daughter, a son's daughter, and a sister. So he said the daughter will get half and the sister will get half. And then he said that go ask Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu the same question. And when those people asked him, Ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, he said that I'll make the same decision that the Prophet Islam did, that half will be given to the daughter, right? 1/6 will be given to the granddaughter, takmilatan lithulusain, to make 2/3. And whatever remains will go to the sister, which means he just made the sister the asaba, and the daughter and the granddaughter, they remained as sahibatul furuz, or shareholders. Upon which Abu Musa Ashari replied that as long as a person like Ibn Mas'ud is amongst you, you don't need to ask many questions. So Abu Musa Ashari made his ijtihad, but his ijtihad wasn't correct. And Ibn Mas'ud, based on the Prophet's decision, informed that the sister in this case is not amongst the Ashab al-Furuz, but rather she's amongst the Asaba. So to summarize, every female who, when left, who in terms of being a shareholder, receives half or receives two-thirds. Half when she's alone and two-thirds when there's more than one, right? And as you know, there are four categories to that. That's the daughter, granddaughter, full sister, and agna sister. They become asaba alongside with their brothers, right? So that's one thing. And the second thing is to remember that the same people, I mean the asaba bil ghayr, who are potentially asaba bil ghayr, these four category of people, daughter, granddaughter, full sister, and add and half sister, can sometimes combine with each other to make the category of asaba ma'al ghayr. أي that asaba bil ghayr and asaba ma'al ghayr, these two categories of residuary revolve around these four types of women who were initially shareholders, that is daughter, granddaughter, full sister, and half sister. Now the difference between asaba bil ghayr and ma'al ghayr, because of another with other, we already discussed that in asaba bil ghayr, the intrinsic residuary is always present. And secondly, he's the one who transforms her share into residue, into being asaba, and then it's shared with her brother according to the لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ 2-to-1 share principle. And as far as the asaba mal ghayr are concerned, the intrinsic residuary is never present. And second of all is that the daughter and granddaughter, they receive their shares. They're shareholders as they were before. And it's the sister, full or half, who becomes the residuary and takes whatever is left. Now, there's one important note that must be made before we end the topic of the asabat, is that when talking about al-ukht al-shaqiqa, or the full sister, right? When she becomes asaba ma'al ghayr, when she becomes a residuary with an other, or in other words, when she becomes a residuary in the presence of a daughter or a granddaughter, she becomes just like a full brother. What this basically means is that in the case, take the example, that person dies, he leaves behind a daughter, a granddaughter, a full sister, and a half brother. Now we know the daughter gets half, the granddaughter gets 1/6. Now, if you look at the half brother, he's an intrinsic residuary, potentially, and the half sister, she is potentially a residuary with another, al-asaba ma'al ghayr. When she's an asaba ma'al ghayr with the daughter and granddaughter, in other words, when she becomes an asaba, is as she was a male, or she was the full brother, not the full sister. And you know, when the full brother is present, then he's given preference over the half brother, right? Because his connection to the deceased is more strong than the connection of the half brother. So similarly, in the case when the full sister becomes an asaba with another, or asaba ma'al ghayr, she takes on the role of the full brother, resulting in the fact that if she is an asaba, then she will be the reason that the half brother gets nothing. The half brother no longer remains as a residuary, and he's not entitled to anything whatsoever. Right? So hopefully that part of the asaba is also understood. Now, if you guys have any questions at the moment about what we've discussed, I would be happy to take them.